How does a military win almost every single battle on the ground, yet still lose the entire war in the minds of its own people? On the 21st of November 1967, General William Westmoreland stood before a packed audience at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. He was relaxed, confident, and reassuring. He declared that a new phase of the conflict was beginning and that the end was finally coming into view. But just over 2 months later, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year holiday in late January 1968, the festive silence of Tet was shattered. Over 80,000 troops launched a simultaneous offensive on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam. The world's most advanced military was caught completely off guard, and the illusion of imminent victory evaporated in a single night. To understand how this sudden shockwave was even possible, we have to look back at the quiet strategic chessboard of late 1967, where both sides were planning their next decisive moves. By late 1967, the conflict had reached a grueling, costly deadlock. The United States had poured massive resources into the war, with American troop strength climbing to approximately 485,000 personnel by the end of the year. Despite relentless bombing campaigns and high enemy body counts reported weekly on the evening news, the ground war remained a grinding stalemate. In Washington, the political cost of this open-ended commitment was mounting rapidly. The administration of President Lyndon B. Johnson was under intense pressure to prove to an increasingly skeptical American public that there was indeed a light at the end of the tunnel. Meanwhile, over 700 miles to the north, the leadership in Hanoi was facing its own severe crisis. The relentless American bombing of North Vietnam and the strain of a prolonged war were draining the nation's economy and manpower. Hanoi's leaders realized they could not win a protracted war of attrition against the unmatched industrial and military might of the United States. In late 1967, the Central Committee of the Lao Dong Party formalized a dramatic shift in strategy through Resolution 14. They decided to launch a massive, high-stakes gamble, a coordinated general offensive targeting major cities and towns across South Vietnam. The goal was to trigger a popular uprising among the southern population, collapse the Saigon government, and force the United States to the negotiating table. While some historians argue Hanoi fully anticipated the psychological shock this would cause in America, others suggest their primary focus was a decisive military victory on the ground. But executing an offensive of this scale required absolute secrecy, leading to one of the most complex military deceptions of the 20th century. How do you hide 80,000 soldiers moving toward more than 100 different targets? The answer is simple, yet incredibly difficult to execute. You make your opponent look somewhere else entirely. In late 1967 and early 1968, the leadership in Hanoi began pulling the strings of a massive strategic distraction. They wanted to draw American combat power away from the highly populated coastal plains and major cities, dragging them into the rugged, isolated border regions. The centerpiece of this diversion was a remote plateau in northwestern South Vietnam, just south of the demilitarized zone. This was Khe Sanh, a combat base garrisoned by U.S. Marines. On the 21st of January 1968, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive artillery bombardment and ground assault on the base, surrounding it completely. For General William Westmoreland, the attack on Khe Sanh was not a surprise. It was the battle he had been waiting for. He looked at the maps and saw a striking, dangerous parallel to history. To the American command, Khe Sanh looked exactly like Dien Bien Phu, the remote valley where French forces had been surrounded and decisively defeated by Vietnamese forces 14 years earlier. Convinced that Hanoi was seeking a conventional showdown to repeat that historic victory, Westmoreland made the defense of Khe Sanh his absolute priority. The United States launched Operation Niagara, a colossal aerial bombardment campaign that dropped over 100,000 tons of bombs around the base. Thousands of elite American troops were rushed northward to reinforce the region, pulling them away from the vital urban centers down south. But while American eyes were fixed on the misty, blood-soaked hills of Khe Sanh, the real threat was quietly moving in the opposite direction. Thousands of Viet Cong fighters were slipping into the major cities of South Vietnam. This was not a sudden rush, but a slow, meticulous infiltration that had been underway for months. To move men and supplies into heavily policed urban areas, the planners relied on the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Fighters disguised themselves as peasants, merchants, and students. They blended into the growing crowds of civilians traveling to visit family for the upcoming Lunar New Year, the Tet holiday. The weapons and ammunition required for the offensive had to be smuggled in ahead of time. They were hidden under loads of agricultural produce, concealed in the false bottoms of delivery trucks, and packed inside flower carts destined for holiday markets. In some of the most striking accounts from this period, weapons were even transported inside coffins during mock funeral processions, complete with professional mourners, to avoid raising the suspicion of local police. Once inside the cities, these weapons were stored in pre-arranged safe houses, waiting for the hands that would soon claim them. As January drew to a close, both sides agreed to a temporary, 36-hour truce to honor the sacred Tet holiday. Tet was, and remains, the most important celebration of the Vietnamese year, a time of family reunions and ancestral worship. In previous years, informal holiday truces had generally been respected, with only minor violations. Believing this year would be no different, the South Vietnamese military granted holiday leave to a large portion of its forces. Defense plans were relaxed, and many soldiers went home to their families. Imagine the scene in late January 1968. In Washington and Saigon, officials were breathing a sigh of relief, expecting a brief pause in the grinding conflict. In the northern hills, the Marines at Khe Sanh were braced for a brutal siege, surrounded by fog and incoming artillery. But in the bustling, brightly lit streets of Saigon, Hue, and Da Nang, the markets were packed with people buying yellow apricot blossoms and holiday treats. Music played, and firecrackers were laid out to welcome the Year of the Monkey. Yet, hidden in those very crowds, checking their watches in dark safe houses, were thousands of soldiers waiting for a signal. The trap was fully set, and the clock was ticking down to midnight. In the early hours of January 31, the countdown reached zero, and the silent infiltration turned into a loud, coordinated explosion of violence. At exactly 2:45 a.m., on the 31st of January 1968, a massive explosion tore through the quiet night in Saigon. A group of 19 elite Viet Cong sappers, belonging to the C-10 Sapper Battalion, had driven up to the perimeter of the United States Embassy in a taxicab and a small truck. Using plastic explosives, they blew a chunk out of the reinforced concrete wall surrounding the compound and crawled through the gap. To appreciate the shock of this moment, you have to understand what that embassy represented. Opened just 5 months earlier, the modern, 6-story building was designed to be a fortress. It was a concrete symbol of American power, permanence, and security in Southeast Asia. It was supposed to be completely invulnerable. Yet, in a matter of seconds, the war had breached its outer defenses. The 2 military policemen on duty at the gate managed to fire back and close the gate, but they were killed in the opening moments of the assault. The 19 sappers were now inside the courtyard, but they were pinned down. They never managed to penetrate the heavy, shatterproof doors of the main building, where a handful of Marine guards had barricaded themselves. Instead, a chaotic, close-quarters firefight erupted on the manicured lawns, amidst the decorative planters and concrete pillars. As the sun began to rise over Saigon, the scene outside the embassy turned surreal. Because the building was located in the heart of the city, near major hotels housing foreign correspondents, journalists and television crews rushed to the scene. They did not have to travel to a remote jungle to find the war. It was happening right on the street in front of them. For 6 hours, television cameras captured American soldiers and military police taking cover behind curbs and brick walls, firing into their own embassy compound. The raw footage, beamed across the Pacific, showed a chaotic scramble to retake the grounds. By mid-morning, the siege was over. All 19 sappers were either dead or captured. But the physical outcome of the battle mattered far less than the images it produced. To millions of Americans watching the evening news, the message was clear and terrifying. If the United States could not even protect its own embassy in the heart of Saigon, how could it claim to be winning the war? But the drama in Saigon was only a fraction of the story. Across South Vietnam, the offensive was unfolding on an unprecedented scale. More than 100 cities, towns, and military bases were under simultaneous assault. The sheer coordination of the attack stunned military planners in Saigon and Washington. Nowhere was the clash more devastating than in the historic city of Hue. Located near the border with North Vietnam, Hue was the ancient imperial capital, a place of immense cultural and spiritual significance to all Vietnamese. It was divided by the Perfume River, with the northern half dominated by the citadel, a massive 19th century fortress with stone walls up to 30 feet thick. In the early hours of January 31, thousands of North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong troops launched a surprise assault on Hue. Within hours, they had seized control of almost the entire city, including the vast citadel. Above the historic flag tower, they raised the blue and red flag of the National Liberation Front. To retake the city, the United States and South Vietnamese forces had to wage a campaign unlike any they had faced before. This was not the mobile, jungle warfare of search and destroy missions. This was brutal, block by block, room by room, urban combat. For 26 days, U.S. Marines and South Vietnamese soldiers fought through cold, drizzling rain to reclaim Hue. The combat was slow, grueling, and destructive. Soldiers had to clear ancient, reinforced stone buildings one by one, using grenades, flamethrowers, and heavy artillery. The historic architecture of Hue was systematically reduced to rubble. Television reporters walked alongside the troops, filming the grim reality of the battle. The world watched as young Marines ducked behind crumbling walls, bandaged their wounded comrades, and loaded casualties onto the backs of tanks. By the time the last resistance in the citadel was cleared in late February, Hue was a city of ruins. Thousands of civilians had lost their lives, and many more were left homeless. The raw, unedited footage of these battles, broadcast daily into American living rooms, presented a stark, undeniable contrast to the optimistic official reports of the preceding months. While Allied forces slowly regained control of the physical battlefield, a much larger, psychological battle was being lost across the Pacific. If we look strictly at the military map, the Tet Offensive was an absolute disaster for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. The grand strategic objective of the offensive was to spark a massive, spontaneous popular uprising among the people of South Vietnam. That uprising simply did not happen. Instead of joining the fighters, most civilians fled the violence, seeking safety behind Allied lines. The physical toll on the attackers was catastrophic. The Viet Cong, who bore the brunt of the initial waves in the cities, were nearly wiped out in many areas. Their local networks, built up over years of quiet, dangerous work in villages and neighborhoods, were decimated. Scholars of the conflict generally agree that it would take years for the southern insurgency to recover, forcing North Vietnam to rely far more heavily on its regular army for the remainder of the war. Here is the supreme irony of Tet. On the battlefield, the United States and its South Vietnamese allies had won a decisive, crushing victory. They had repelled almost every single attack, inflicted staggering losses, and held on to every major city. But back in the United States, this military triumph felt like a devastating defeat. This profound disconnect gave birth to a phrase that would define an entire era of American politics: the credibility gap. It was the growing, canyon-like chasm between what the government told the public and what those citizens saw with their own eyes on their television screens. For years, officials had insisted that the enemy was exhausted, that their forces were declining, and that the end was in sight. Yet, overnight, 80,000 enemy troops had managed to strike across the entire country, even breaching the grounds of the American embassy. The public felt deeply, fundamentally misled. The tipping point came in late February. Walter Cronkite, the anchor of CBS Evening News and widely considered the most trusted man in America, traveled to Vietnam to see the situation for himself. He walked through the ruins of Hue and spoke with soldiers on the ground. On the 27th of February 1968, he broadcast a personal, prime-time editorial. He did not call for surrender, but he delivered a sobering, realistic assessment. He told millions of viewers that the only realistic conclusion was that the war was mired in a stalemate and that negotiations were the only honorable way out. While popular legend often claims President Lyndon B. Johnson watched the broadcast and declared he had lost the country, historians have found no contemporary record of such a moment. But the political reality was just as dramatic. The president's approval ratings plummeted, and anti-war challengers within his own party were gaining rapid momentum. The political ground was shifting beneath his feet. On the evening of the 31st of March 1968, President Johnson sat in the Oval Office for a televised address to the nation. He spoke of his desire to seek peace in Vietnam, and then, in his closing remarks, he delivered a bombshell that shocked the world. He announced that he would neither seek nor accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. This dramatic shift in American domestic politics revealed a deeper, more permanent lesson about the nature of modern, asymmetric warfare. The Tet Offensive serves as a masterclass in the psychology of conflict. It demonstrated that in the modern era, the ultimate measure of military power is not just the size of an arsenal, the sophistication of aircraft, or the grim tally of body counts. Instead, it is measured in the far more fragile currencies of political will and public perception. By bringing the raw, unedited reality of the war directly into American living rooms, the offensive shattered the domestic political consensus required to sustain a long, costly foreign intervention. The enduring lesson of Tet is that a militarily weaker force can achieve a decisive strategic victory by targeting the psychological center of gravity of a stronger adversary. While the physical battles for South Vietnam cities were ultimately won by the United States and its allies, the psychological struggle for the trust of the American public was won by Hanoi. In the wake of the offensive, public opinion polls recorded a dramatic, permanent shift. Gallup polls from early 1968 showed that American approval of the war's handling plummeted to historic lows, with a rapidly growing percentage of the public viewing the entire intervention as a mistake. The physical conflict would drag on for 5 more agonizing years, but after Tet 1968, the fundamental nature of the debate in Washington had changed. The central question was no longer how the United States would achieve a decisive victory, but how it would systematically withdraw. This post-Tet period marked the beginning of preliminary peace talks in Paris and the gradual implementation of Vietnamization. The policy of shifting the combat burden to South Vietnamese forces while steadily withdrawing American ground troops. It remains a sobering realization that the ultimate outcome of a war can be decided thousands of miles away from the battlefield, in the minds of citizens watching television. This leaves us with a critical question that still resonates in global conflicts today. Because history is rarely as simple as winners and losers on a physical battlefield, the Tet Offensive of 1968 proved to the world that perception can be far more powerful than sheer military might. It showed how a tactical defeat on the ground can transform into a strategic victory in the court of public opinion. This forces us to look at our own world. How do you think modern media, social networks, and the internet shape our understanding of conflicts today, compared to the television screens of 1968? Does that old credibility gap, the distance between official statements and on-the-ground reality, still exist in the way we receive news today? We want to hear your thoughts, so let us know in the comments below. If you found this exploration of the psychological turning point of the Vietnam War valuable, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with someone who loves history. Your support helps us keep telling these complex, human stories. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next chapter.